My name is Eva Green, and I am 28 years old. 48 hours ago, my parents sat in a mahogany-paneled law office and tried to erase my future. They smiled as they announced that my brother Bradley would receive 90% of our grandfather's estate, while I was left with a meager 10%. They thought I would just lower my head and accept it. They thought my grandfather was too old and naive to see through my brother's expensive suits and hollow charm. They were wrong. Before the ink could even touch the paper, the notary flipped to the final page and read a handwritten footnote that turned my golden child brother pale and made his high-priced lawyer walk right out of the room. Before I tell you exactly what that footnote said and why my brother is now one bad decision away from wearing handcuffs, please take a second to hit like and subscribe to Sophia Vengeance. Drop your age in the comments below. I love seeing the different generations tuning into these stories. Now let me take you back to the moment the polished illusion of the Green family fractured. The air in Marcus Reed's office smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The leather chairs groaned as my mother Patricia crossed her legs and smoothed the sharp crease of her silk skirt. She offered Marcus a practiced, sympathetic smile. My father William sat rigid beside her. Across the desk sat Bradley. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than my entire car. Beside him, his wife Courtney tapped her manicured nails against the face of her diamond watch. Only Bradley's corporate lawyer seemed out of place. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his upper lip and tapped an expensive silver pen against his legal pad. Marcus opened the thick manila folder holding the final will of my grandfather, Charles. My mother did not even wait for him to clear his throat. The arrangement is simple, Marcus said. 90% of the estate goes to Bradley, 10% to Eva. That is what Papa wanted. She turned to look at me. Her gaze was as warm as winter ice in South Dakota. Bradley has the mind to manage a legacy of this scale. You have your little history books, Eva. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. For 2 decades, I had played the quiet shadow in this family. I pressed my fingernails deep into my palms and kept my mouth shut. Bradley smirked. He picked up a pen from the desk, ready to sign his name to millions. Marcus cleared his throat. He did not pass the document across the desk. Instead, he flipped a thick stack of pages over to the very back. Actually, Patricia Marcus said his voice was flat and steady. There is a handwritten footnote here added and notarized 3 days before Charles passed. The pen slipped from Bradley's fingers. It clattered against the polished wood. Marcus adjusted his glasses. Charles appended a conditional clause to the split. The 90% allocation to Bradley is contingent upon an immediate independent forensic audit of his current investment firm. If the audit reveals any financial irregularities or misappropriation of funds previously loaned by Charles, the split reverses 90% to Eva, 10% to Bradley. All the oxygen vanished from the room. Bradley's lawyer shot out of his chair. He shoved his legal pad into his leather briefcase, leaned down and whispered something frantic into Bradley's ear. Then the lawyer turned and walked straight out of the office without looking back. My father's jaw went slack. The smug smile washed off my mother's face. My grandfather had not just left me an inheritance, he had handed me a loaded gun. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Bradley's fleeing attorney. That small sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent office. No one breathed. For 28 years, I had watched my family command every room they entered. They were loud and imposing and unshakable. Now they were frozen. My father stared at the empty space where the high-priced lawyer had just been sitting. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Beside him, my mother gripped the armrests of her leather chair so hard her knuckles turned a translucent white. Bradley was the first to break the stillness. He let out a harsh, breathless laugh that sounded more like a cough. He reached up and loosened his expensive silk tie. His fingers were trembling. A fine sheen of sweat had gathered along his hairline, ruining his perfect grooming. "This is a joke," Bradley stammered, his voice pitched half an octave higher than normal. Papa was 89 years old. Marcus! He was confused. He did not know what he was signing. You cannot possibly validate a last-minute scribble from an old man who was on pain medication. Marcus Reed did not react to the outburst. The seasoned estate attorney simply adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the document. "Charles Green was not confused," Bradley Marcus said evenly. "I met with your grandfather privately 3 days before his heart failed. He was sharp. He refused to take his prescribed morphine that morning specifically so his cognitive state could never be questioned in court. He brought in 2 independent doctors to verify his mental competence. He also hired an external notary. Every single legal precaution was taken. This footnote is ironclad." I sat perfectly still in my chair. My heart pounded a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I pictured my grandfather lying in his hospice bed. Papa Charles had built an immense agricultural and real estate empire out of nothing but South Dakota dirt and relentless stubbornness. He never trusted the flashy venture capital world that Bradley inhabited. Papa used to tell me that wealth was measured by what you could hold in your hands, not by the digital numbers flashing on a screen. He knew Bradley was a charlatan. He knew my brother had built a house of cards. And in his final days, Papa used his fading strength to lay a trap. My mother finally found her voice. Her practiced, sympathetic smile was gone, her features sharpened into something feral and hostile. "Marcus, you listen to me," Patricia demanded. Her tone was sharp enough to cut glass. "We reviewed the drafts of this will weeks ago. It was settled. Bradley gets 90%. He is the only one equipped to handle the family portfolio. Eva is an archivist. She works in a basement cataloging dusty letters. She does not know the first thing about corporate management. You are going to strike that footnote from the record right now." Marcus folded his hands over the manila folder. "I cannot do that, Patricia," he replied. "An irrevocable trust amended by a competent grantor is binding. The 90-10 split remains on the table, but the execution of those funds is now legally paused." "Paused," my father echoed. The words seemed to choke him. William leaned forward. "What exactly do you mean by paused?" Marcus turned his gaze toward Bradley. "The estate is hereby frozen," Marcus explained. "The liquid assets, the property deeds, the corporate accounts, none of it moves until the forensic audit is concluded. We are bringing in an independent investigative firm from Chicago. They will demand full access to the ledgers of Bradley's venture capital firm. They are going to trace every single dollar Charles ever loaned to you over the past 7 years. They will look for discrepancies, hidden debts, and unauthorized transfers. If your books are clean, Bradley, then 90% is yours. If they are not, Eva takes the empire." I watched my brother's face cycle through a sequence of emotions. First came shock, then came denial. Finally, a raw, undeniable terror settled over his features. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed visibly against his collar. Next to him, his wife Courtney shifted in her seat. She was the daughter of a prominent state senator. She had grown up surrounded by political sharks, and she knew how to read the water. She leaned closer to her husband. Her voice was quiet, but the subtext was sharp. "Bradley," Courtney whispered, "why did your lawyer just run out of the room? If your firm is doing well, an audit should not matter. Why did he run?" "Shut up, Courtney," Bradley snapped. The venom in his voice made her recoil. She stared at him as if seeing a stranger. The polished, charming husband she had married was cracking right in front of her. The air in the office grew suffocating. My parents realized that bullying the attorney was not going to work. The law was a wall they could not climb over. So they did what they always did when they encountered an obstacle. They turned their attention to the weakest link in the room. They turned to me. My father rotated his chair to face me. His expression softened, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Eva, sweetie," William said. His voice took on a sickeningly sweet tone that made my skin crawl. "You know, Papa was acting out of grief and old age. He was paranoid at the end. You do not want to drag your own brother through a stressful corporate investigation. It would take months. It would ruin the family reputation." My mother nodded eagerly. She reached out and patted my knee. Her touch felt like a physical burn. "Exactly, Eva. You are a reasonable girl. You do not care about money. You have your little apartment. You have your books. You can just sign a waiver right now. You can tell Marcus you declined the audit, and we can all walk out of here and be a happy family." I looked down at her manicured hand resting on my knee. For my entire life, I had craved her affection. I had shrunk my own dreams to avoid overshadowing her precious son. I had accepted the leftover scraps of their attention. A year ago, I would have nodded. I would have signed away my rights just to earn a fleeting smile from my mother. But I could still hear the ghost of Papa Charles whispering in the room. I remembered the scent of his pipe tobacco and the rough texture of his calloused hands. He had used his dying breaths to hand me a shield. I was not going to drop it. I slowly stood up. I brushed my mother's hand off my knee. The fabric of my slacks whispered in the quiet room. I slung the strap of my canvas tote bag over my shoulder. I looked at Marcus Reed. "Execute the footnote, Marcus," I said. My voice was quiet, but it did not waver. "Bring in the auditors from Chicago. I want every single ledger examined. Eva." My father barked. He jumped to his feet. "You do not know what you are doing." I turned to face him. "I know exactly what I am doing, Dad," I replied. "I am honoring Papa's wishes." I did not wait for their response. I walked toward the heavy oak door. I could feel the heat of their glares burning into my back. As I reached for the brass handle, Bradley finally spoke. His voice was a low, menacing growl. "This is not over, Eva," he said. "You are going to regret this. I will make sure you lose everything." I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. I walked out of the building and onto the sidewalk. The cold South Dakota wind whipped my hair across my face. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders. I knew my brother was not making an idle threat. I knew my parents would not simply let their golden boy fall without a fight. The battle in the office was only the opening skirmish. They were going to come for me. They were going to use every weapon in their arsenal to break me. I unlocked my modest sedan and slid behind the steering wheel. My hands were shaking slightly, but my mind was clear. I drove back toward my apartment, unaware that my parents were already plotting their next move. I did not realize that the moment I walked through my front door, the real warfare was going to begin. The drive from Marcus Reed's office to my apartment usually took 15 minutes. That evening, it felt like hours. The streetlights of Sioux Falls cast long-reaching shadows across the dashboard of my sedan. My mind raced through the chaotic events in the mahogany-paneled room. I kept seeing the look of pure terror on my brother's face. I kept hearing the sound of his lawyer's rapid footsteps retreating down the corridor. I pulled into the parking lot of my modest brick building. The air had grown colder, carrying the sharp bite of a looming South Dakota frost. I carried my canvas tote bag up the 3 flights of stairs. My apartment was my sanctuary. It smelled of Earl Grey tea and the faint dust of archival preservation paper. I placed my keys on the counter and took a slow, deep breath, expecting the silence to calm my racing heart. I had barely turned the deadbolt when a loud, heavy fist pounded against the wood of my front door. The sound rattled the brass peephole. I did not need to look through the glass to know who was standing in the hallway. The polite rules of social boundaries had vanished the moment Marcus read that footnote. I turned the lock, the door shoved open before I could even grasp the handle. My father pushed past me into the narrow entryway. My mother followed close behind him. She kicked the door shut with the heel of her designer pump. The loud click of the latch sounded like a prison cell locking. They looked nothing like the polished commanding figures who had sat in the estate office an hour ago. My father's expensive tie was pulled loose. His suit jacket hung open, revealing a damp stain of sweat blooming through his dress shirt. My mother clutched her expensive leather purse tightly against her chest, as if it were a life preserver. Her perfectly styled hair was beginning to fray at the edges.
"What are you trying to do to us, Eva?"
My father barked. His voice filled the small space bouncing off the walls of my living room. He began to pace. His heavy leather shoes thudded against my hardwood floor. He knocked his shin against a low bookshelf, sending a stack of historical journals sliding to the rug. He did not even look down to see what he had dropped.
"You do not understand how venture capital works,"
he continued. His face flushed a dark, dangerous red.
"Audits tie up capital for months, Eva. They freeze lines of credit. They spook investors.
You are going to trigger a financial panic that Bradley cannot survive." I stood by the kitchen island. I kept my hands folded together to hide their slight trembling. I watched the man who was supposed to protect me unravel in my living room. For my entire life, William Green had measured his worth by the balance in his bank accounts and the prestige of his country club memberships. He worshipped success, and he believed Bradley was the ultimate symbol of that success. "I am honoring Papa's wishes," I said softly. "If Bradley's firm is legitimate, an audit will only prove his success. Why are you so terrified of an accountant looking at a ledger?" My father stopped pacing. He planted his hands on his hips and stared up at the ceiling. A heavy, ragged sigh escaped his lips. He lowered his head and looked at me. His eyes were wide and filled with a raw, undeniable panic.
"Because we co-signed his initial loans, Eva,"
my father confessed. The words hung in the quiet apartment like a thick, suffocating smoke. My mother stepped forward, her pristine image fractured right in front of me.
5 years ago, Bradley needed a heavy injection of liquid capital to secure his flagship property,"
Patricia said. Her voice trembled just a fraction. "His credit was overextended. Your father and I put up our own assets as collateral. We signed the guarantor documents. We are financially tethered to his firm. If his accounts are frozen by an investigative team, his creditors will call in the margins. If Bradley defaults, they come for us. They take our savings. They take our home." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The narrative they had spun for years suddenly shattered. They had always painted Bradley as a self-made financial genius. They had mocked my quiet, steady career in historical preservation while parading his flashy lifestyle to all their friends. But it was all a house of cards built on my parents' secret financial backing. They were not just protecting their favorite son out of blind parental devotion, they were protecting their own survival. Patricia reached into her leather purse. She pulled out a crisp white document and slapped it flat onto my granite kitchen counter. The paper slid a few inches before stopping near my tea kettle. "This is a legal waiver," my mother said. Her tone shifted from panicked confession to cold calculation. "We had Bradley's secondary attorney draft it the moment we left Marcus Reed's office. It states that you formally decline the forensic audit. It formally requests that the 90-10 split proceed without the investigative condition." My father stepped closer to the island. My father stepped. He pulled a pen from his breast pocket and tossed it onto the paper.
"Sign it, Eva,"
he ordered. His voice carried the heavy weight of a command.
"You sign that paper right now and we call Marcus. We put an end to this nightmare tonight."
I looked down at the black ink on the page. The legal jargon blurred together into a messy block of text. I looked back up at my parents.
"And if I refuse?"
I asked. My mother did not hesitate. Her eyes narrowed into tiny dark slits.
"If you drag your brother through an audit, you will destroy this family," she hissed. "You will bankrupt your father and me. If you do not sign that waiver, you will no longer be a part of this family. We will cut you out entirely. No holidays, no phone calls, no financial support. You will be dead to us."
The threat echoed in my small kitchen. For 28 years, those words would have broken me. I had spent my childhood seeking their approval. I had attended the colleges they suggested. I had stayed in South Dakota just to remain close to them. I had swallowed every insult and brushed off every slight just to maintain the fragile piece of our family dynamic. The thought of losing them, of being cast out and erased, used to be my greatest fear. I turned my head slowly away from the waiver. My gaze landed on the front of my refrigerator. Pinned beneath a cheap magnet was a faded photograph. It was a picture of Papa Charles and me sitting on the wraparound porch of his farmhouse. I was 12 years old. He was showing me how to bind a broken spine on an old diary. His eyes in the photograph were steady and warm. He had spent his final days ensuring I would have a shield against the exact people standing in my kitchen. I looked back at my parents. The polished illusion was entirely gone. I saw them for what they truly were. They were frightened, desperate people willing to sacrifice their daughter to protect a liar. They were willing to use my lifelong desire for their love as a bargaining chip to save their own skin. The fear that had lived in my chest for nearly 3 decades evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, solid clarity. I reached out and picked up the silver pen from the counter. My father let out a long breath of relief. My mother relaxed her tight grip on her purse. I held the pen in my hand, feeling its heavy weight against my fingers. Then I set it down gently on the far side of the counter away from the document. "No," I said quietly. My father blinked. He stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "What did you just say?" he asked. His voice barely registered above a whisper. "I am not signing the waiver," I replied. My voice grew stronger, filling the space they had tried to dominate. "I am not waiving the audit. If Bradley built a legitimate business, he has nothing to fear. If he stole money, he will face the consequences. And if you risk your own home to fund his lies, that is your burden to carry. I am honoring Papa's will." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother's face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. She snatched the waiver off the counter. The paper crumpled loudly inside her tight fist. "You are going to regret this," she promised. The venom in her voice raised the fine hairs on the back of my neck. "You think you are safe because of some old man's footnote. You have no idea what we can do." She turned on her heel and marched toward the door. My father followed her. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at me one last time. "You are no daughter of mine, Eva," he said. The words were meant to inflict a fatal wound. Instead, they felt like the snapping of a heavy chain. The door slammed shut behind them. The framed pictures on my living room wall rattled from the force of their exit. I stood alone in my quiet apartment. The air still carried the faint smell of my father's nervous sweat and my mother's expensive perfume. I knew they were not going to simply walk away and accept defeat. They had just declared a war for their own survival. They could not beat me in a legal office, so they were going to change the battlefield.
They were going to try and destroy my reputation, my career, and my sanity. Before Monday morning, I walked over and locked the deadbolt on my front door. The real fight had just begun. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of my bedroom window, but it brought no warmth. I had not slept. My phone vibrated against the wooden nightstand with a relentless buzzing sound that drilled into my skull. I reached out and picked up the device. The screen glowed with dozens of unread notifications. Patricia and Courtney had not wasted the overnight hours. They had gone to work. I scrolled through the text messages. The vitriol poured out from the illuminated text. My aunt sent a long paragraph accusing me of elder abuse. A cousin I had not spoken to in 3 years called me a greedy vulture. My mother had spun a masterful narrative before the sun even crested the South Dakota horizon. The story they were selling to our extended family in the Sioux Falls elite was vicious and highly coordinated. Eva, the bitter, underachieving archivist, had finally snapped. I had supposedly manipulated a dying, confused old man. They claimed I waited until Charles was medicated and vulnerable to forge a fake footnote, stealing my brilliant brother's hard-earned inheritance. They painted Bradley as the tragic victim and me as the calculating villain. I needed to clear my head. I put on my coat and walked down the chilly street toward my favorite local bakery. Routine was my only defense against the rising panic. The bell above the bakery door chimed its familiar cheerful note. The shop smelled of roasted espresso beans and warm cinnamon. Usually this place offered a quiet sanctuary before my workday began. Today the atmosphere shifted the moment my boots crossed the threshold. Mrs. Higgins stood near the pastry display. She had played bridge with my mother every Tuesday for the last 15 years. She had attended my high school graduation. I offered her a polite smile and said, "Good morning." Mrs. Higgins froze. Her eyes darted to my face and then dropped quickly to the tiled floor. She clutched her handbag, pulled her coat tight, and turned her entire body away from me. She whispered something urgent to the woman standing next to her. The barista behind the counter wiped down the espresso machine and avoided my gaze entirely. He handed me my paper coffee cup without saying a single word. I walked back out into the cold air. The cup burned my fingers. I was becoming a ghost in my own hometown. The social exile was deliberate and precise. Patricia knew exactly which strings to pull to isolate me from my community. She wanted to create an environment so hostile and uncomfortable that I would gladly sign the legal waiver just to make the public whispering stop. I drove across town to the Historical Society. The brick building housed the state archives and served as my professional refuge. I loved the scent of binding glue and aged parchment. I loved the quiet dignity of preserving the past. I set my canvas tote bag down on my desk in the basement. Before I could even turn on my computer, my desk phone rang. It was my boss, Arthur, requesting my presence in his upstairs office. Arthur sat behind his cluttered desk, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked older than his 50 years. He gestured for me to close the door. The heavy click of the latch sent a fresh wave of dread through my veins. Arthur did not offer me a seat. He leaned back and let out a long, weary sigh. "I received a very troubling phone call this morning, Eva," Arthur said. His voice lacked its usual warm cadence. "Courtney Green contacted me. She mentioned that her father is currently chairing the state cultural funding committee. She also mentioned that you are currently embroiled in a rather ugly legal dispute involving questionable ethics and the manipulation of a senior citizen." My chest tightened. Courtney was weaponizing her inherited political clout. She grew up attending fundraising galas with senators and judges. She understood that power was not just about money, it was about leverage. Arthur picked up a pen and tapped it against his desk pad. Courtney heavily implied that the funding committee might look unfavorably upon an organization that employs someone with pending legal investigations. He continued, I do not want to pry into your personal family matters. Eva, you are a brilliant historian, but the society relies on that annual state grant to keep the doors open. We cannot afford a political scandal. I need you to resolve this quickly, or I will have to ask you to take an unpaid leave of absence. The walls of the office seemed to shrink. They were not just trying to ruin my reputation. They were coming for my livelihood. They wanted to strip away every pillar of support in my life until I had nothing left to stand on except their mercy. And I knew their mercy only existed if I surrendered my grandfather's legacy. I assured Arthur I would handle the situation and retreated back to the basement. The silence among the dusty shelves felt suffocating. I packed my belongings and left the building early. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of gray streets and bare trees. I locked my front door and let the heavy silence of my living room wash over me. I sat on the edge of my sofa and watched the notifications continue to pile up on my phone screen. The hatred rolled in wave after wave. My family possessed no moral bottom. They were willing to destroy my career, alienate me from my friends, and assassinate my character just to protect Bradley's fragile ego and their own hidden debts. They truly believed I was the same quiet, submissive girl who had spent 28 years avoiding conflict. They thought the weight of social rejection would crush my spirit. They were wrong. The cruelty did not break me. It forged something cold and hard inside my chest. As I stared at the dark screen of my phone, my resolve crystallized. My family had severely underestimated the temperament of an archivist. I spent my days sifting through thousands of discarded documents just to find a single thread of truth. I possessed a capacity for patience that they could not comprehend. I knew how to wait in the dark. I realized that fighting them in the court of public opinion was a losing battle. They had the money and the connections to scream louder than I ever could. If I wanted to win, I had to play a different game. I needed to buy myself time, and I needed Bradley to become careless. Arrogance was his greatest weakness. If I made him believe he had won, he would drop his guard. He would make a fatal mistake. I reached for my phone and prepared to tell the biggest lie of my life. I was going to offer them a false surrender. The sharp knock on my front door rattled the loose pane of glass in the frame. I set my empty coffee mug in the sink and walked down the short hallway. A courier in a damp gray uniform stood on my welcome mat. He held a thick cardboard envelope sealed with bright red tape. He did not ask how my day was going. He just shoved a digital clipboard toward me and pointed a calloused finger at the signature line. I scribbled my name and took the package. It weighed heavy in my hands. The return address, printed in stark black ink, belonged to a high-powered corporate litigation firm based in Chicago. I carried the envelope to my kitchen island. I sliced the red tape with a paring knife. A thick stack of legal documents slid out onto the granite counter. The header of the first page read, "Notice of intent to sue." I scanned the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. My brother Bradley was not just threatening me. He was initiating total financial warfare. The document outlined a pending lawsuit for tortious interference with an expected inheritance. The Chicago lawyers claimed my reckless demand for an audit was causing severe undue hardship to Bradley's investment firm. They demanded punitive damages. They threatened to freeze my meager bank accounts, garnish my future wages at the Historical Society, and bury me under a mountain of attorney fees that would take 3 lifetimes to repay. My chest tightened. The air in my apartment felt thin and hard to breathe. Bradley wanted to break my spirit. He wanted to make the cost of honoring my grandfather so unbearably high that I would surrender just to survive. The social isolation from my mother's smear campaign had been a quiet, cruel poison. This lawsuit was a blunt iron hammer aimed directly at my skull. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. The metallic hum of my refrigerator filled the silence. If I fought him head-on right now, I would lose. I did not possess the financial resources to engage in a protracted legal battle with a Chicago litigation team. I needed a different strategy. I needed to buy time. Most importantly, I needed my brother to make a careless mistake. I understood the psychology of a bully. Bullies only respect submission. As long as I stood defiant, Bradley would keep throwing punches, but if I played dead, he would turn his attention elsewhere. He would celebrate his victory, and he would drop his guard. I opened my eyes. I reached for my smartphone resting near the sink. I prepared to execute a tactical deception. I dialed the familiar number of my parents' house. The line rang 3 times before my father answered. His greeting was brief and sharp. He sounded like a man who was running out of patience. "Dad," I said. I pitched my voice a full octave higher than normal. I forced a slight ragged tremble into my throat. I let a long, shaky breath hiss through my teeth. "What do you want, Eva?" William asked. His tone carried the cold, hard edge of a judge delivering a sentence. "I cannot do this anymore," I whispered. I squeezed my eyes shut to help push a real tear down my cheek. I needed to feel the emotion so he would hear it. "The phone calls, the whispers, the lawsuit, it is too much. You win. I will sign the waiver." The heavy silence on the other end of the line was incredibly satisfying. I could picture the rigid posture of my father suddenly relaxing. I heard a long, rushing exhale of breath. He covered the receiver with his hand, but I could still hear the muffled sound of him speaking to my mother. "She broke. She surrendered," he whispered. I heard Patricia let out a sharp, victorious laugh. William brought the phone back to his ear. His voice shifted. The cold hostility vanished. It was replaced by a sickening magnanimous warmth. "I knew you would come to your senses, Eva," he said. "We just want what is best for the family. I will have the courier pick up the signed document in an hour." "No," I said quickly, keeping the panic in my tone. "I cannot sign it today. I printed the waiver, but the legal language is confusing. I hired a cheap strip mall attorney over on East 10th Street just to look over the liability clauses. I want to make sure I am not held responsible for any estate taxes later. He said he needs the weekend to read it. I will sign it first thing Monday morning. I promise." My father hesitated. I held my breath. I knew the fictional cheap lawyer was a gamble, but William Green despised low-rent attorneys. He viewed them as slow, incompetent pencil pushers. He chuckled, a soft, arrogant sound. "Fine, Eva," he agreed. "Let your little storefront lawyer read it. Just have it signed and notarized by 9 o'clock Monday morning. We will call Marcus Reed and cancel the Chicago auditors. Enjoy your weekend." The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear. The tremble in my hands ceased. The fake tears dried on my cheeks. My posture straightened. The mask of the defeated, submissive daughter fell away, leaving only cold, sharp clarity. I had just bought myself 72 hours. I knew exactly how Bradley would react when William called him with the good news. My brother would pour a glass of expensive scotch. He would toast to his own brilliance. He would believe the threat was neutralized. But as an archivist, I knew that canceling the audit did not solve Bradley's actual problem. It only gave him a window to clean up the crime scene. Why had his corporate lawyer panicked so hard in Marcus Reed's office? It was not just about hiding paper ledgers. I remembered the stories Papa Charles used to tell me on the wraparound porch. My grandfather ran his agricultural empire like a fortress. He distrusted modern digital banking. He kept his primary wealth in secure offshore accounts. He used analog hardware to protect those funds.
Bradley had been forging signatures and siphoning money for years. But to truly bury the theft and cover his margin calls, he needed to finalize a series of large wire transfers. He could not do that from a laptop in Sioux Falls. He needed Papa's physical encryption keys. He needed the analog secure tokens and the offline hard drives. Without those physical objects, Bradley could not move the offshore money to hide his tracks before Monday. Where would a paranoid old-school farmer keep his most valuable analog hardware? I looked out my kitchen window. The South Dakota sky was bruising a deep, dark purple. A storm was rolling in over the plains. Papa Charles never kept his secrets in a bank vault. He kept them close. He kept them at the Black Hills farmhouse. Bradley was arrogant, but he was not stupid. He knew he had a narrow window of opportunity. He believed I was cowed and defeated. He believed the estate lawyers were standing down until Monday. He would not wait. He would head out to the property right now to sanitize the house and secure those analog tokens. He thought he had the entire weekend to leisurely tear the farmhouse apart without any interference. He was wrong. I walked into my bedroom and grabbed a heavy canvas jacket from the closet. I pulled on my sturdy leather boots. I walked back to the kitchen and grabbed my archival tote bag. I tossed in a heavy metal flashlight, a set of precision screwdrivers, and a pair of cotton preservation gloves. I knew the layout of that old farmhouse better than anyone in my family. I knew the creak of every floorboard and the hidden spaces behind the plaster walls. My brother was heading into my territory. He was stepping into a world of physical history and hidden truths. I grabbed my car keys from the counter. I locked the deadbolt behind me and hurried down the stairs. The cold wind slapped my face as I stepped out into the parking lot. I climbed into my sedan and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life. I shifted into gear and pulled out onto the darkening street. I was driving straight into the storm, and I was ready to meet my brother in the dark. The drive out of Sioux Falls felt like descending into another world. The bright streetlights of the city quickly gave way to the desolate, stretching shadows of the South Dakota highway. The heater in my sedan blasted warm air against my frozen boots, but a deep chill remained lodged in my chest. Dark clouds rolled across the night sky, swallowing the moon and casting the rolling plains into a profound, heavy darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel. I kept the speedometer pinned just below the legal limit. My grandfather bought the Black Hills property 50 years ago. Charles Green had transformed a patch of rocky dirt into a sprawling agricultural empire through sheer stubborn willpower. The farmhouse was his sanctuary. It sat miles away from the nearest paved intersection, hidden behind a thick, dense line of towering pine trees. As I turned my car onto the familiar gravel access road, my headlights swept across the tree line. I expected to see the house sitting dark and undisturbed. Instead, a harsh, bright halogen beam pierced the night. I hit the brakes and brought my sedan to a crawling halt near the edge of the property. I turned off my headlights and shifted the engine into park. Through the dense pines, I could see a rented commercial moving truck backed right up to the front porch. The loading ramp extended down to the grass. Beside the truck sat Bradley's leased silver Porsche. The driver's side door was hanging open. The interior dome light illuminated the fine leather upholstery. I did not storm out of my car. I did not run onto the lawn screaming. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I dialed the county dispatch center. The operator answered on the second ring. "My name is Eva Green," I said. My voice was steady and unnervingly calm. "I am the co-beneficiary of the Charles Green estate. A hostile party is currently trespassing and removing assets in violation of an active probate freeze. I need a deputy dispatched to the property immediately." I gave the address and ended the call. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, grabbed my canvas tote bag, and stepped out into the biting wind. The scent of impending rain hung heavy in the air. I walked up the long gravel driveway, staying near the shadows of the pine branches. As I drew closer, the sounds of the chaotic scene reached my ears.
"Hurry up!"
Bradley shouted. His voice echoed off the wooden siding of the farmhouse. He stood on the porch, pointing a rigid finger at two men wearing heavy work jackets.
"Just load the filing cabinets. I do not care if you drop them. Get them in the truck right now."
One of the movers struggled to carry a heavy oak drawer down the ramp. Bradley grabbed the edge of the wood and yanked it forward. Loose papers spilled out onto the damp grass. Bradley kicked them aside. He looked feral. His expensive designer suit jacket was tossed over the railing of the porch. His dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and dark patches of sweat stained his underarms. This was not the polished venture capitalist who charmed politicians at charity galas. This was a cornered, desperate animal tearing apart a cage. I stepped out of the shadows and walked into the glare of the halogen work lights. Bradley froze. He dropped his hands to his sides. His chest heaved as he sucked in the cold night air.
"You,"
he breathed. The words sounded like a curse. I stopped 10 feet away from the moving truck. I let the silence stretch between us. The two hired men paused on the ramp, holding a stack of cardboard boxes. They looked back and forth between me and my brother, unsure of who held the authority. "Put those boxes down," I told the workers. My tone was even and authoritative. "You are aiding in the commission of a felony. Do not listen to her." Bradley snarled. He took a menacing step toward me. He pointed a shaking finger at my face.
"This is my property. I own 90% of this estate. You are trespassing, Eva. Get back in your cheap little car and drive away before I make you regret showing your face here." Before I could answer, the sweeping flash of red and blue lights illuminated the tree line. The siren wailed a brief, sharp burst as a county sheriff cruiser turned onto the gravel driveway. The vehicle parked at an angle, blocking the exit for the moving truck. A tall deputy wearing a heavy winter uniform stepped out into the cold. He rested his right hand casually on his utility belt and approached the porch. "What seems to be the problem here?"
the deputy asked. He looked at the spilled papers, the rented truck, and then at my brother.
"Officer!" "Thank God you are here,"
Bradley said. His posture immediately shifted. He forced a wide, charismatic smile and smoothed his messy hair. He tried to project the aura of a wealthy, respected citizen. "My sister here is having a bit of a mental episode. She is harassing me while I try to clear out some of my late grandfather's old junk. I am going to need you to escort her off my land." The deputy looked at me. I reached into my coat pocket and produced my smartphone. I opened the digital copy of the legal notice Marcus Reed had drafted earlier that afternoon. "My brother is lying, deputy," I said clearly. I handed the phone over. "This estate is currently under a contested legal freeze pending a forensic audit. Neither beneficiary has the right to remove a single piece of paper from this residence. My brother is attempting to destroy financial evidence." The deputy read the screen. His eyes scanned the formal letterhead of the estate attorney and the specific injunction codes. He handed the phone back to me and turned his attention to Bradley. The polite deference vanished from the officer's posture.
"Tell your men to put the boxes back on the porch,"
the deputy ordered. His voice was firm.
"You cannot be serious,"
Bradley sputtered. The charming facade cracked instantly.
"Do you know who I am?"
"My father-in-law is State Senator Cole. I can have your badge sitting on my desk by tomorrow morning." The deputy did not flinch.
"You can call the senator tomorrow,"
he replied. "Tonight, you are putting the boxes down, and you are vacating the premises. If you attempt to load another item into that truck, I will place you under arrest for violating a probate injunction. Do you understand me?" Bradley stared at the officer. The reality of his situation crashed over him. His secret weekend window was closing. He turned his head and locked eyes with me. The sheer venom in his gaze was terrifying. The veins in his neck stood out like thick, dark cords. He pointed his shaking finger at my chest.
"You are dead, Eva,"
he spat.
"You think a single footnote can stop me?"
I adjusted the strap of my canvas tote bag. My archival tools weighed heavy against my hip. I did not blink. I did not back away. Bradley shoved past the movers. He snatched his suit jacket off the railing and stomped across the wet grass toward his Porsche. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, sending a cloud of exhaust into the cold air. The tires spun wildly in the mud, kicking up wet gravel as he swerved around the sheriff cruiser and sped down the dark driveway. The hired workers quickly set the boxes down on the porch. They climbed into the cab of the moving truck and followed my brother out of the property. The deputy waited until their taillights vanished into the trees. He turned to me.
"Secure the house, ma'am,"
the deputy said.
"Call us if he comes back."
I thanked him. The cruiser backed out of the driveway and the red and blue lights faded into the night. I was finally alone. The silence of the Black Hills rushed back in to fill the void. I walked up the wooden steps of the porch. I stepped over the spilled files and pushed open the heavy oak front door. The devastation inside the farmhouse stole my breath. Bradley had torn the place apart with the frantic, destructive energy of a starving predator. The beautiful Persian rug in the foyer was sliced open. The mahogany bookshelves in the living room were tipped forward, spilling hundreds of classic novels onto the hardwood floor. Papa's favorite leather recliner sat gutted in the corner with its stuffing ripped out and scattered like snow. I walked slowly through the ruined rooms. Drawers were smashed to splinters. Floorboards in the modern dining room addition were pried up with a crowbar. Bradley thought he had searched everywhere. He was desperate to find the analog secure tokens and the offline hard drives that would allow him to finalize his offshore wire transfers. Without those keys, his embezzlement trail remained wide open for the Chicago auditors. But as I looked at the destruction, I realized my brother had searched the farmhouse the same way he lived his life. He looked for the obvious. He checked behind the expensive paintings. He tore apart the modern desk. He searched the areas a wealthy corporate executive would deem valuable. He never paid attention to our grandfather. Bradley spent his holidays skiing in Aspen or networking at country clubs. He hated the dust and the dirt of the farm. He never sat on the wraparound porch and listened to Charles talk about surviving the harsh winters of his youth. Papa did not trust digital cloud servers, and he certainly did not trust modern wall safes. Papa was a man of the earth. He hid things where the dirt met the wood. The house was eerily quiet. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes. I unzipped my canvas tote bag and pulled out my heavy metal flashlight. I clicked the button. A thick beam of bright white light cut through the floating dust motes, illuminating the ruined hallway. I knew what Bradley was looking for, and I knew exactly where he failed to look. I walked past the destroyed study and the gutted living room. I headed straight toward the back of the house, toward the dark, narrow corridor behind the kitchen pantry. Guided by a memory that my golden child brother was always too busy to hear, I reached out and grasped the cold iron latch of the cellar door. I pulled the iron latch downward. The cellar door complained with a harsh metallic screech that echoed through the empty hallway. A rush of stagnant air greeted me. It carried the distinct scent of damp earth-aged pine and the faint sour tang of forgotten blackberry preserves. I aimed the beam of my flashlight down the narrow wooden staircase. Dust motes danced frantically in the harsh white light. The wooden treads groaned under my boots as I descended into the dark. I moved carefully, keeping one hand pressed against the rough concrete wall. The basement was a space Bradley avoided even when we were children. He hated the dark corners and the damp chill. He preferred the bright manicured lawns and the paved driveways of his affluent neighborhoods. But I always loved the quiet subterranean world beneath the farmhouse. It was a place where things were kept safe. It was a place built to endure the brutal South Dakota winters. As my boots touched the packed dirt floor at the bottom of the stairs, a memory washed over me. The smell of aged wood triggered a vivid recollection from 18 years ago. I am 10 years old again. The basement is warm, lit by a string of bare yellow bulbs hanging from the exposed joists. I am wearing denim overalls covered in chalky dust. Beside me stands Papa Charles. He wears a faded flannel shirt that smells of cherry pipe tobacco and motor oil. His large calloused hands easily lift a heavy crate of newly sealed glass jars. He slides the wooden box onto a sturdy shelf built against the back wall. "You always put the strongest jars on the bottom," Eva Papa says. His voice rumbles deep in his chest like distant thunder. "A solid foundation holds the weight of the world." He wipes his brow with a cotton handkerchief. I watch him step back to admire the neatly organized rows. I ask him why he keeps so many important things in the dark instead of using a shiny safety deposit box in town. Papa lets out a low rumbling chuckle. He taps the toe of his heavy leather work boot against the packed dirt. "The bank relies on computers, Eva," he tells me. His eyes crinkle at the corners, but a smart man trusts the floorboards. The memory faded, leaving me standing alone in the cold, silent cellar. I swung the flashlight beam toward the back corner. The sturdy wooden shelves were still exactly where he built them. Bradley had not bothered to come down here. He did not care about canned peaches or pickled beets. He was searching for modern steel safes and hidden digital keypads. He did not understand the mind of a farmer who survived the Great Depression-era mindset of his own parents. I walked over to the furthest shelf tucked deep into the darkest corner of the basement. 4 heavy wooden crates sat stacked on the bottom tier. They were covered in a thick layer of gray dust and sticky cobwebs. I set my flashlight down on a nearby barrel, angling the beam to illuminate the floor. I grabbed the edges of the top crate. The rough wood scraped against my bare palms. I pulled backward with all my strength. The box was incredibly heavy, filled with glass jars containing decades-old preserves. I dragged it to the side. The glass clinked softly inside. I moved the second crate, then the third. My breathing grew ragged in the quiet space. Sweat pricked my forehead despite the chilly basement air. I gripped the final box and dragged it away from the wall, exposing a rectangular patch of bare dirt and aged pine planks. I dropped to my knees. The cold ground seeped through my denim jeans. I pulled off my leather gloves and ran my bare fingertips over the rough grain of the wood. I pressed down on the first plank. It felt solid. I moved to the second board. It did not yield. I traced the edge of the third piece of pine. As I applied pressure to the top left corner, the opposite end popped up just a fraction of an inch. A sharp electric thrill raced down my spine. I wedged my fingers into the narrow gap. The rough splinters bit into my skin. I pulled upward. The pine plank lifted away with a soft scraping sound. I set the wood aside and grabbed the flashlight. I aimed the beam into the dark cavity beneath the floor. A rectangular package wrapped in dark green oilcloth rested in a shallow dirt trench. I reached down and lifted the bundle. It was surprisingly heavy. The oilcloth felt stiff and slightly greasy to the touch. I carried the package over to the bottom step of the wooden staircase and sat down. The cold draft from the floor swirled around my ankles. I unrolled the protective fabric, folding the thick corners back one by one. Beneath the canvas lay a solid iron lock box. The metal was cold and unyielding. It featured a simple brass latch. There was no digital keypad. There was no biometric scanner. Papa Charles relied on a sturdy mechanical clasp. He never locked things away from me. He knew I was the only person in the family who would ever think to look here. I flipped the brass latch upward. It gave way with a satisfying metallic click. I pushed the heavy iron lid open. The hinges squealed a high-pitched protest. Inside the box rested Papa's true legacy. A thick leather-bound ledger filled the right side of the compartment. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling. Resting on top of the ledger was a small pouch made of dark blue velvet. The fabric was tied shut with a simple silk cord. I picked up the pouch and pulled the drawstring open. I tipped the contents into my open palm. 3 black plastic rectangles tumbled out along with 2 metal thumb drives. I recognized the items immediately. They were secure analog banking tokens and encrypted offline storage drives. These were the keys to the offshore fortress. These devices generated the dynamic passcodes required to authorize high-level international wire transfers. Without these physical tools, Bradley was permanently locked out. He could not finalize the movement of his stolen funds. He could not erase the digital footprint of his embezzlement before the Chicago auditors arrived. He was trapped. I set the tokens carefully back into the velvet pouch and pulled the drawstring tight. I placed the bag deep inside my coat pocket. Then I reached into the iron box and lifted out the leather ledger. The binding groaned as I opened the heavy cover. I balanced the flashlight on my knee to illuminate the pages. The smell of old paper and dried ink filled my senses. I turned the heavy cream-colored pages. Papa's handwriting was meticulous. The letters were sharp and precise, written in dark blue fountain pen ink. This was not a diary. It was a financial autopsy. Every single page documented a meticulous timeline of betrayal. I traced the columns of numbers with my index finger. Papa had recorded every loan he ever authorized for Bradley's venture capital firm. Beside those entries were the dates and amounts of unauthorized withdrawals from the corporate estate accounts. Papa had tracked the rot festering inside his own family for nearly 7 years. He had taped bank transfer receipts directly onto the pages. I saw forged signature stamps. I saw dummy corporations listed with complex routing numbers. The sheer volume of the theft made my head spin. Bradley had siphoned an unimaginable fortune out of the family empire while smiling at Sunday dinners and bragging about his self-made success. My chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. I was not afraid. The panic that had gripped me in my apartment earlier that evening evaporated. It was replaced by a profound, terrifying clarity. I realized the immense gravity of the weapon I now held in my hands. Papa had known his heart was failing him before he could bring his grandson to justice. So he built a snare. He used the 90-10 split as bait to force the forensic audit, and he hid the incontrovertible proof waiting for me to find it. He trusted me to finish the war he had silently waged from his armchair. I continued flipping through the ledger. The timeline of embezzlement progressed year by year, but as I reached the entries from 6 months ago, the pattern shifted. Bradley had grown desperate. The venture capital market had taken a steep downturn. The forged withdrawals from the estate were no longer enough to cover his mounting margin calls. He needed an immense influx of cash to prevent his creditors from seizing his firm. I turned one more page. A folded legal document was tucked between the bindings. I pulled the stiff paper out and smoothed the creases against my thigh. As my eyes scanned the bold text at the top of the page, a cold dread washed over me. The theft did not end with Papa's offshore accounts. Bradley had done something far worse. He had crossed a boundary that would destroy our parents' entire existence. I carried the heavy iron lockbox out of the dark cellar. The old wooden stairs groaned in protest beneath my boots. I navigated the ruined hallway of the farmhouse. stepping carefully over the torn books and shattered porcelain that my brother had left in his wake. The cold night air hit my face the moment I pushed through the front door. The wind had picked up howling through the dense South Dakota pine trees. I pulled the heavy oak door shut and turned the deadbolt securing the silent house. I walked swiftly down the gravel driveway toward my parked sedan. The temperature had plummeted, bringing a sharp, biting chill that seeped through my canvas coat. I tossed my tote bag onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the steering wheel. I started the engine and cranked the heater to the highest setting. The blower motor hummed, pushing stale, warm air into the freezing cabin. I reached into the back seat and retrieved my laptop. I rested the computer on the center console and flipped the screen open. The bright artificial glow illuminated my face and cast long shadows across the interior of the car. I pulled the small velvet pouch from my pocket. My fingers were stiff from the cold as I untied the silk drawstring. I withdrew one of the metal thumb drives and inserted it into the side port of my computer. A prompt appeared on the screen demanding a security key. I opened my grandfather's leather ledger. I turned to the inside cover where he had penned a string of alphanumeric characters in his familiar dark blue ink. I typed the code. The progress bar loaded, and a dense directory of digital folders filled my screen. For the next 2 hours, the isolated gravel road became my private archival reading room. I cross-referenced the physical handwritten entries in the ledger with the digital files stored on the drive. I approached the data the same way I handled centuries-old historical documents. I looked for patterns. I traced the origins. I followed the narrative hidden within the numbers. The true horror of Bradley's actions slowly came into sharp focus. It was textbook corporate embezzlement executed with a staggering level of arrogance. My brother had set up a complex web of dummy corporations spanning across 3 different states. He generated hundreds of fake vendor invoices for heavy agricultural equipment and land surveying services that never actually existed. He used his position of trust within the family to forge our grandfather's signature on the authorization forms. Once the estate funds were released to those phantom vendors, Bradley routed the liquid cash directly into his own venture capital firm. He had siphoned an unimaginable fortune from the family empire. He used the stolen money to cover his failing investments and to fund his lavish lifestyle. He bought his tailored suits, his diamond watches, and his bank-owned sports cars with the money Papa Charles had spent a lifetime pulling from the dirt. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. Bradley had sold himself to the Sioux Falls elite as a visionary financial genius. In reality, he was nothing more than a parasite feeding off the legacy of a dying man. I continued to scroll through the digital directories. The timeline of the embezzlement progressed steadily year after year, but as I reached the files dated 6 months ago, the pattern fractured. The steady stream of fake invoices was no longer enough. The venture capital market had suffered a steep downturn. Bradley's high-risk tech investments had collapsed. His creditors had issued relentless margin calls demanding immediate repayment. He had grown desperate. He needed a colossal influx of cash just to keep his firm solvent. I turned to the final pages of the physical ledger. Papa had highlighted a specific series of transactions involving a new shell company. The entity was named Elm Street Holdings. The name snagged in my memory. Elm Street was the address of my childhood home. It was the sprawling colonial estate where my parents currently lived. I moved my cursor and clicked on the digital folder bearing the same name. A list of scanned legal PDFs populated the screen. I opened the first document. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat. The file was a property deed transfer. I recognized the official seal of the county recorder. I scrolled down to the signature lines. William Green and Patricia Green were listed as the primary grantors. They had formally signed over the total ownership of their primary residence to Elm Street Holdings. My heart hammered against my ribs.
I opened the second PDF. It was a dense corporate operating agreement for the shell company. Bradley Green was listed as the sole managing member. He held unilateral control over every asset within the holding company. I opened the third and final document. It was a high-interest secondary mortgage agreement issued by a predatory commercial lender. Bradley had used his unchecked power as the managing member to leverage the property. He had stripped every single cent of equity out of my parents' home to pay his outstanding margin calls. A wave of physical nausea washed over me. The sour taste of bile rose in the back of my throat. I gripped the edges of the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. My brother did not just steal from our grandfather. He had robbed our own parents blind. I pictured my father William manicuring the pristine front lawn of that colonial house. He viewed that property as the ultimate monument to his perceived social status. I pictured my mother, Patricia, hosting her high society dinner parties in the formal dining room, boasting about her brilliant, wealthy son. They loved that house more than they loved me. They had spent decades filling it with expensive furniture and hollow pride, and they no longer owned a single brick of it. They had blindly signed the transfer documents. Bradley likely pitched the LLC to them as a brilliant tax shelter or a sophisticated wealth management strategy. They trusted their golden child without hesitation. They never bothered to read the fine print. They handed him the keys to their entire existence, and he immediately burned their sanctuary to the ground to save himself. The bitter irony of the situation struck me like a physical blow. Just a few hours ago, my parents had invaded my small apartment. They had stood in my kitchen radiating hostility and panicked desperation. They had ruthlessly demanded that I sign a legal waiver. They had weaponized our extended family against me. They had orchestrated a vicious smear campaign to ruin my professional reputation and isolate me from my community. They threatened to cut me off entirely and treat me as if I were dead. They were doing all of this to protect the very son who had already stolen their future. If Bradley's financial crimes were exposed, his venture capital firm would be liquidated. His creditors would seize all outstanding assets, including Elm Street Holdings. The commercial lender would foreclose on the secondary mortgage. If my brother went down, William and Patricia were instantly bankrupt and homeless. They were fiercely defending a burning house, unaware that the roof had already collapsed. The sheer audacity of my brother's greed made me sick to my stomach. He was willing to sacrifice our parents' twilight years just to maintain his fragile, wealthy facade for a few more months. He felt no remorse. He felt no loyalty. He was a hollow man driven only by his own vanity. I sat in the idling car and listened to the steady rhythm of the heater fan. The cold resolve that had taken root in my chest earlier that evening hardened into something unbreakable. I was no longer just fighting to honor my grandfather. I was holding the power to end the entire toxic illusion that had suffocated me for 28 years. I closed the PDFs and ejected the thumb drive. I returned the metal token to the velvet pouch and pulled the silk drawstring tight. I placed the pouch and the leather ledger carefully into my archival tote bag. I shut my laptop and rested it on the passenger seat. My family thought they had broken me. They believed their social warfare had forced me into submission. They thought I was going to walk into an office on Monday morning and sign away my grandfather's legacy. They expected a quiet surrender. I shifted my sedan into drive and turned the steering wheel toward the dark highway. The headlights cut a bright path through the falling rain. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I was going to let my brother celebrate his false victory. I was going to let him step onto his biggest public stage. And then I was going to hand over the evidence that would shatter his world into a million jagged pieces. The time for tactical deception was ending. The time for the final strike was rapidly approaching. The weekend passed in a heavy, breathless silence.
I remained inside my apartment, ignoring the relentless incoming calls from my parents and the hostile text messages from Courtney. The analog tokens and the leather ledger sat locked inside my archival tote bag. The digital files were backed up on 3 separate encrypted drives. I had spent Saturday and Sunday preparing my arsenal. I did not need to engage in their social warfare anymore. I was holding a nuclear option. Monday morning arrived with a pale gray sky. The sharp South Dakota wind rattled the window panes as I brewed a strong pot of black coffee. I did not dress in the subdued, muted tones I usually wore to the Historical Society. I chose a structured navy blazer and a crisp white blouse. I pulled my hair back into a severe knot. The reflection in my bathroom mirror did not show a quiet, submissive girl. It showed an archivist ready to close the book on a toxic dynasty. At exactly 8:50, I parked my sedan in front of Marcus Reed's office. The air outside felt charged. I knew my father was sitting by his phone waiting for the confirmation that I had signed the waiver. I knew Bradley was nursing an expensive espresso, believing he had successfully navigated his crisis. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked directly past the receptionist. I did not ask for an appointment. I strode into Marcus Reed's mahogany-paneled office just as the clock struck 9. Marcus looked up from his desk. He wore a crisp gray suit. His expression shifted from mild surprise to deep professional concern when he saw the look on my face.
"Eva,"
he said. He closed a manila folder and folded his hands.
"Your father called me an hour ago. He informed me that you were bringing an assigned waiver to decline the forensic audit."
I stopped in front of his desk. I unzipped my canvas tote bag.
"I did not sign the waiver, Marcus,"
I replied. My voice was steady, carrying the cold, hard edge of absolute certainty.
"I brought you something much more important."
I reached into the bag and pulled out the heavy iron lockbox. I set it down on the polished wood. The metal scraped softly against the finish. I opened the brass latch and withdrew the dark blue velvet pouch and the thick leather ledger. I placed the items deliberately in front of the seasoned attorney. Then I pulled out a thick stack of printed documents highlighting the forged signatures and the fake corporate invoices. Marcus frowned. He picked up the velvet pouch and loosened the drawstring. The black plastic analog tokens tumbled out onto his desk. He stared at the devices for a long moment before his eyes shifted to the printouts. The silence in the room grew heavy. He picked up the first page of the financial summary. His eyes tracked across the columns of numbers. He flipped to the next page, then the next. As the seasoned estate attorney absorbed the staggering volume of the evidence, his professional composure began to fracture. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He set the papers down and opened the leather ledger. He recognized his late client's handwriting immediately.
"Eva,"
Marcus breathed. His voice was hushed, dropping to a tight, strained whisper. "Where did you find this?" Papa Charles trusted the floorboards. I answered simply, "Read the entries from 6 months ago. Marcus, look at the documents detailing Elm Street Holdings." Marcus turned the pages. He found the secondary mortgage agreements and the property deed transfer signed by my parents. He stopped breathing. He removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes with the palms of his hands. He looked like a man who had just watched a train derail in slow motion.
"This is not just a breach of fiduciary duty,"
Marcus said. His tone carried the heavy weight of an impending catastrophe.
"This is extensive corporate embezzlement. This is wire fraud. He forged Charles's signature to siphon millions. He secretly leveraged his own parents' primary residence to cover commercial margin calls." He looked up at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of awe and terror. "Eva, this is a federal crime.
If I process this information, your brother is facing decades in a federal penitentiary.
His venture capital firm will be liquidated. Your parents will lose their home. It will trigger an unprecedented financial scandal in Sioux Falls. I stood tall. I did not flinch. I know exactly what this means, Marcus, I said. I want you to initiate the independent forensic audit immediately. Furthermore, I want you to contact the Securities and Exchange Commission right now. Submit these proofs to the federal investigators. I want an emergency freeze placed on Bradley's investment firm before noon. He must not be allowed to move another single dime. Marcus stared at me for a long moment. He was searching my face for any sign of hesitation or regret. He found none. He slowly nodded. He reached for his desk phone. I will contact the federal authorities immediately, he agreed. The legal machinery begins today. Before you make that call, I need one specific item from Papa's personal effects, I said. Marcus paused with his hand hovering over the receiver. What do you need? When Papa Charles drafted his most important correspondence, he used a specific tool, I explained. I need the heavy brass wax seal, the one engraved with the family crest. Marcus opened the bottom drawer of his desk. The drawer contained the physical items my grandfather had carried in his pockets on the day he died. Marcus retrieved a small polished wooden box and handed it to me. I opened the lid. The heavy brass seal rested on a bed of dark velvet. The metal felt cold and powerful in my palm. The Green family crest featured a stylized pine tree rooted over a sharp anvil. Papa used it only for his most absolute, unbreakable promises. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. I had already placed a copy of the forged transfer receipts inside. I asked Marcus to print a certified copy of the emergency SEC freeze request he was about to file. He handed me the fresh document. I folded the crisp paper and slid it into the envelope. I walked over to a small side table where Marcus kept a decorative candle. I asked him for a lighter. He handed me a silver Zippo. I ignited the wick. I pulled a stick of deep red sealing wax from the wooden box. I held the wax over the flame until it began to melt. I let the hot crimson liquid drip onto the flap of the envelope. The wax pulled into a thick, perfect circle. I pressed the heavy brass crest firmly into the hot wax. I held the seal in place for 10 seconds, allowing the impression to set. I lifted the brass tool. The family crest was perfectly embedded in the hardened red circle. It was an undeniable symbol of authority. No one in my family could question the origin of this document. It was a message straight from the grave carrying the full weight of my grandfather's legacy. I slipped the sealed envelope into the interior pocket of my blazer. I thanked Marcus for his swift action. I turned and walked out of the mahogany-paneled office. The air outside felt lighter. The gray clouds were beginning to break apart, revealing patches of pale blue sky. My brother had spent the entire weekend celebrating his false victory. He believed he had successfully crushed his sister and secured his stolen empire. He was currently preparing for his most important social event of the year. Friday night was the annual Sioux Falls Heritage Gala. It was a high-profile charity event that my parents sponsored every single year. This year, they were using the gala as a memorial tribute to Papa Charles. It was a calculated stage designed to cement Bradley's social standing and project an aura of unshakable wealth before the estate was officially settled. I was not invited. Patricia had explicitly made sure my name was removed from the guest list. She wanted me isolated and invisible. She wanted Bradley to shine under the chandeliers while I sat alone in my apartment. But I was no longer the quiet shadow. I was armed. I held the undeniable proof of Bradley's financial crimes, and I carried the certified federal freeze order sealed with our grandfather's crest. Bradley was about to step onto his biggest public stage, surrounded by his wealthiest investors and his powerful political allies.
He was going to stand at a podium and lie to the entire city. I unlocked my sedan and slid behind the steering wheel. I placed my hands on the leather grip. The engine roared to life. I did not drive back to my apartment. I drove toward the most exclusive boutique in downtown Sioux Falls. I needed a dress. I needed armor. I was going to attend the Heritage Gala. I was going to walk into a room full of people who despised me, and I was going to detonate a truth so explosive it would leave nothing but ashes behind. Friday night arrived carrying a crisp frost that clung to the manicured lawns of the Sioux Falls Country Club. The annual Heritage Gala served as the crown jewel of the local social calendar. Valets in dark uniforms scrambled to open the doors of imported luxury sedans. The evening air carried the scent of expensive cologne and roasted prime rib. I sat in my parked sedan watching the city elite parade into the grand foyer. My canvas coat and heavy leather boots were gone. I wore a floor-length gown the color of dark emeralds. The silk draped like liquid armor over my shoulders. My hair was pinned back in a tight, severe knot. I slipped a heavy cream-colored envelope into a sleek evening clutch. The red wax seal bearing my grandfather's crest lay hidden inside. William and Patricia had sponsored this charity event for a decade. They used it to showcase a philanthropic facade to their wealthy peers. Tonight they hijacked the gathering to serve a dual purpose. The invitation billed the evening as a memorial tribute to Charles Green. In reality, it was a coronation ceremony for his grandson. They intended to cement Bradley's financial dominance and project an aura of untouchable wealth before the estate underwent formal probate. Patricia had explicitly stricken my name from the guest list. She wanted her disobedient daughter erased from the family narrative. She expected me to stay home broken and defeated by her social isolation tactics. I stepped out of my vehicle. The cold wind brushed against my bare neck. I bypassed the valet stand and walked directly up the grand stone steps. Two ushers in tailored tuxedos stood at the main entrance holding digital guest manifests. They did not stop me. Perhaps they recognized my face from old family portraits. Or perhaps they simply yielded to the quiet, undeniable authority in my stride. I pushed through the heavy double doors and entered the grand ballroom. The space was an ocean of crystal chandeliers and pristine white tablecloths. A string quartet played a soft classical melody in the far corner. The room hummed with the polite chatter of politicians, real estate developers, and corporate executives. I took 10 measured steps onto the plush carpet. It did not take long for the social temperature to drop. Mrs. Higgins, the woman who had shunned me at the bakery, turned her head. Her polite smile faltered. She leaned over and whispered behind her hand to her husband. That whisper moved through the crowd like a swift, invisible current. Heads turned one by one. The gentle hum of conversation fractured into a tense, buzzing silence. I scanned the room and located my parents near the front stage. Patricia wore a black velvet gown draped in real pearls. She was laughing at a joke told by a local judge. She held a crystal flute of champagne in her right hand. Her eyes drifted across the room and locked onto my emerald dress. The laughter died in her throat. Her fingers went limp. The crystal flute slipped from her grasp and shattered against the polished marble floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed across the sudden quiet. William spun around to see what caused the noise. His face flushed a dark, dangerous red when he saw me standing near the entrance. I did not look at them for more than a heartbeat. My attention shifted to the raised stage at the front of the ballroom. Bradley stood behind a wooden podium adorned with a lavish floral arrangement. Courtney stood one step behind him, playing the role of the devoted, adoring wife. She wore a diamond necklace that caught the brilliant light of the chandeliers. Bradley gripped the edges of the podium. He leaned toward the microphone. He had just begun his keynote address when the sound of my mother's breaking glass interrupted his rhythm. He looked out over the crowd and saw me. A brief flicker of confusion crossed his features, followed by a quick flash of pure, arrogant disdain. He thought I was a broken woman arriving to beg for forgiveness in front of his peers. He believed his brutal campaign of social warfare had forced me to show up and surrender. He cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie. He decided to ignore my presence and continue his performance. My grandfather, Charles, built his life on a foundation of transparency. Bradley spoke into the microphone. His voice resonated through the state-of-the-art sound system. His tone dripped with a fake practiced grief. He believed that family trust was the ultimate currency. Tonight we honor his legacy by pledging to build an honest future. We are expanding our venture capital firm to reflect his core values of integrity and hard work. The entire ballroom erupted into polite, synchronized applause. Women dabbed their eyes with linen napkins. Men nodded with solemn respect. I stood near the back of the room and listened to his hypocritical sermon. It was deliciously cringe-inducing. The display of fake virtue turned my stomach, but it also fueled the cold fire burning in my chest. Bradley paraded his stolen wealth in front of the city elite, oblivious to the invisible guillotine hanging over his neck. He did not know that exactly 30 minutes prior to him taking the stage, an emergency federal order had been executed. The Securities and Exchange Commission had processed the evidence Marcus Reed submitted earlier that afternoon. The federal agents had formally frozen every single corporate account tied to Bradley's firm. His credit lines were severed. His routing numbers were disabled. The immense fortune he was currently boasting about was already locked inside a federal vault. He was standing on a burning bridge and bragging about the beautiful view. I scanned the VIP table situated directly in front of the stage. I found my target. Senator Cole sat in a prime seat flanked by wealthy campaign donors. The senator was a silver-haired man with a sharp, calculating gaze. He was Courtney's father, but more importantly, he was Bradley's primary investor and ultimate political shield. The senator had funneled millions of dollars from his affluent network into Bradley's venture firm. He provided the golden stamp of approval that allowed my brother to operate within the highest circles of Sioux Falls society. William left Patricia's side and began to weave through the crowded tables toward me. He walked with heavy, purposeful strides. He intended to intercept me and physically drag me out of the venue before I could cause a scene. He hissed my name under his breath. I did not wait for him to reach me. I began to walk. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum or flip over a catering table. I moved calmly across the ballroom floor. The crowd parted around me like water yielding to a stone. The sea of imported silk and expensive wool separated to grant me clear passage. The whispers grew louder as I bypassed my angry father. He reached out to grab my bare arm, but I stepped smoothly out of his reach. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the back of a nearby chair. He could not yell without creating a public spectacle, so he was forced to watch me slip away. Bradley watched me approach from the podium. His practiced smile began to strain at the corners. His knuckles turned white where he gripped the wood. His eyes darted to William, signaling him to intervene, but the distance was already covered. I reached the edge of the VIP section. The private security detail standing near the stage took a step forward, assuming I planned to rush the microphone. I did not approach the stairs. I did not approach my brother. I walked directly toward the senator. I pulled the sleek evening clutch from under my arm and rested my fingers on the gold clasp. The time for hiding in the basement archives was over. I was bringing the truth into the blinding light of the chandeliers. I stopped right next to the senator's chair. He looked up at me. His expression was a mixture of polite curiosity and political caution. The string quartet stopped playing. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see what the exiled sister was about to do. The applause faded into a soft murmur of polite conversation. Bradley lowered his hands, gripping the edges of the podium one last time. He offered the crowd a final practice smile of humility. The room glowed under the warm light of the crystal chandeliers. Waitstaff moved silently through the tables, pouring expensive wine into tall glass flutes. I stood beside the most important table in the room. Senator Cole sat back in his plush chair, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo. He exuded the quiet, dangerous energy of a man who spent his life navigating political minefields. I opened my sleek evening clutch. The gold hinge operated silently. I withdrew the heavy cream-colored envelope. The thick paper felt substantial against my fingertips. I did not shove it toward the politician. I held it out with the calm, steady grace of a courier delivering a royal decree. "Senator," I whispered. My voice carried a pleasant, even tone that masked the lethal nature of my delivery. "Since your son-in-law is speaking so eloquently about financial integrity, I thought you should see the certified filings from the estate's forensic auditor. It heavily involves your capital." Cole looked up. His expression revealed mild annoyance. He assumed I was a disgruntled relative trying to drag him into a petty family squabble. He reached out and took the envelope with a dismissive sigh. He planned to humor me for a few seconds before calling security. Then he looked down at his hand. His gaze snagged on the thick pool of crimson wax. The annoyance vanished from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, sudden focus. He traced the embedded impression of the pine tree rooted over the sharp anvil. Senator Cole knew my grandfather. They had crossed paths many times during the early days of South Dakota land development. The senator knew that Charles Green despised political games. Papa Charles never engaged in idle gossip. He used his formal brass crest for one purpose only. The seal represented an undeniable, unbreakable truth. Cole understood the gravity of the object he held. This was not the raving accusation of an exiled sister. This was a message sent directly from the grave of a man he respected. The politician slid his thumb under the flap. The red wax snapped with a crisp, clean sound that seemed louder than the surrounding chatter. He pulled out the folded documents. The first page was the certified federal order from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The heavy black ink of the government letterhead stood out against the white paper. I stood perfectly still and watched the veteran politician read. Time slowed to a crawl. The string quartet began a new piece in the corner of the ballroom, but the music faded into white noise. I counted the seconds in my head. I observed every micro-expression that flickered across the senator's weathered face. 10 seconds passed. Cole scanned the introductory paragraphs of the SEC freeze order. His posture stiffened. The relaxed slouch of a wealthy guest vanished. He sat upright, his shoulders squaring into a defensive, rigid line. 20 seconds passed. He turned to the second page. His eyes tracked the itemized list of forged wire transfers. He saw the dummy corporations. He recognized the offshore routing numbers. The muscles in his jaw tightened into hard knots. The illusion of his brilliant self-made son-in-law fractured right before his eyes. 40 seconds passed. He reached the bottom of the financial summary where the auditor detailed the commingling of the investment funds. Cole saw his own capital listed alongside the stolen estate money. He realized that his personal fortune and his pristine political reputation were currently tied to a sinking ship. He was tethered to a man who was facing imminent federal indictment. 60 seconds passed. Senator Cole finished reading. He did not gasp. He did not shout across the room. A survivor of ruthless political campaigns knows that panic is a weakness. He neatly folded the federal document and slipped it into the breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. His face settled into an unreadable mask of cold, frozen fury. He looked like a man who had just discovered a venomous snake coiled inside his pristine home. He placed his hands on the armrests of his chair and pushed himself up. He rose with a sudden, deliberate force. Courtney stood just a few feet away, having descended the stairs from the stage. She wore a bright, triumphant smile. She saw her father stand and assumed he was rising to offer a toast. She stepped toward him, holding her champagne flute high. "Daddy!" she called out, her voice bright and cheerful. "Was that not a wonderful speech?" Cole did not answer her. He did not even look at his daughter. He stepped around her as if she were a piece of invisible furniture. He bypassed the VIP table and marched directly toward the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom. His strides were long and purposeful. He moved with the terrifying speed of a man fleeing a burning building. Courtney lowered her glass. Her smile withered into a look of sheer confusion. "Daddy?" she called again, her voice cracking slightly. He ignored her. A valet rushed forward to open the grand doors. Senator Cole walked out into the freezing South Dakota night, leaving his daughter and his son-in-law behind. The heavy wooden doors swung shut with a muffled thud. The atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted instantly. The departure of the most powerful man in the room did not go unnoticed. The wealthy campaign donors sitting at the VIP table exchanged nervous, confused glances. The quiet murmurs started at the center and rippled outward. The social elite are highly attuned to shifts in power. They smelled blood in the water. The polite conversation mutated into urgent, frantic whispers. I remained standing near the empty chair. I lifted my chin and turned my gaze toward the stage. Bradley stood behind the floral arrangement, gripping the edges of the podium. He had been soaking in the lingering adoration of the crowd. He lowered his head and prepared to step down to join his primary investor for a celebratory drink. His eyes scanned the front row, searching for the silver-haired politician. He saw the empty chair. Bradley's brow furrowed. He scanned the surrounding tables, looking for his father-in-law. Then his gaze snapped to the back of the room just in time to see the heavy doors swinging shut. The realization began to dawn on him. He knew Cole never left a high-profile charity event before the final toast. It was political suicide. Something catastrophic had just occurred. Bradley's eyes swept frantically back to the VIP table, his gaze locked onto me. I stood mere inches from where his most vital lifeline had been sitting 60 seconds ago. My posture was relaxed. My expression was calm and unyielding. The empty evening clutch rested in my hands. The connection fused in his mind. The smirk of the golden child melted away. The mask of the visionary venture capitalist dissolved, leaving nothing but raw, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his face at a sickening speed. His skin turned the shade of old parchment. He swayed slightly on his feet, bumping his hip against the heavy wooden podium. He stared at me across the sea of crystal and silk. He did not need to ask what I had done. He knew. He could see the truth written in the steady, unforgiving line of my stare. The grenade had just detonated. His secret was out. The federal authorities were already moving. The money was frozen. The political shield was gone. My father William pushed through the crowd and finally reached my side. His face was flushed with anger. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "Ava, what did you do?" He hissed, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Why did the senator just walk out?" I looked at the hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I slowly raised my eyes to meet my father's frantic gaze. "I gave him the truth, Dad," I said, my voice sliced through the rising noise of the panicked ballroom. "The truth that you tried to bury." William looked from my face to the terrified, trembling figure of his son on the stage. The music from the string quartet sounded thin and frail against the mounting chaos.
The illusion of the Green family dynasty was crumbling into dust right in front of the entire city. I turned my back on the empty chair and walked toward the exit, leaving them to choke on the ashes of their own creation. The 3 weeks following the Heritage Gala moved with the cold precision of a falling axe. News of the federal freeze order leaked to the local financial press by Monday afternoon. Senator Cole did not wait for formal indictments to distance himself from the wreckage. The veteran politician held a press conference on the stone steps of the state capitol early Tuesday morning. He stood before a battery of microphones and severed all ties with my brother. Cole cited a profound breach of ethical conduct and assured his constituents that his own investment portfolio was undergoing a voluntary independent review. He threw Bradley to the wolves without shedding a single tear. The senator's public withdrawal acted as the starting pistol for a fierce financial stampede. Bradley's venture firm relied entirely on the perceived confidence of the Sioux Falls elite. Once that political shield fractured, sheer panic set in among his backers. Creditors rushed to call in their debts. Affluent investors filed emergency injunctions, attempting to claw back their capital before the federal authorities seized the remaining accounts. The heavy glass doors of Bradley's downtown office building were chained shut by the end of the week. Federal agents in dark windbreakers carried out dozens of cardboard boxes filled with hard drives and printed ledgers. Bradley tried to fight back. He hired a new criminal defense attorney. He sat in a sterile white interrogation room and attempted to spin a desperate narrative to the federal investigators. My brother claimed he was a naive victim. He argued that he was tricked by offshore partners and rogue accountants. He tried to paint himself as an innocent bystander who simply trusted the wrong people. His own hubris sealed his fate. Just days earlier, Bradley had orchestrated a ruthless public crusade to destroy my character. He had stood in country clubs and bakeries declaring that his sister was a calculating liar who manipulated a dying man. He had established a loud public track record of fabricating vicious stories to save his own skin. When he tried to use that exact same tactic on the federal agents, it backfired in spectacular fashion. The investigators looked at his recent history of deceit and dismissed his claims. The local media picked up the story. Journalists drew a direct, clear line from his cruel rumors about me to his pathetic excuses regarding the stolen millions. He was branded a pathological liar by the very society he had tried to weaponize against me. His ruin was televised on the evening news. The collapse of his professional empire was swift, but the destruction of his personal life proved even more brutal. Courtney did not stand by her man. She was a woman raised in the unforgiving corridors of political power. She recognized a sinking ship and possessed the exact tools required to secure a lifeboat for herself. She did not bother to meet with him to discuss their future. She simply unleashed her father's legal team. 2 weeks after the gala, Courtney filed for divorce. The legal filings were swift and merciless. Her attorneys filed an emergency petition to freeze all of Bradley's remaining personal assets, citing the pending federal charges. They locked him out of his own bank accounts. They seized the keys to the leased Porsche. They barred him from entering their shared luxury condominium in downtown Sioux Falls. He went from sipping vintage champagne at charity events to sleeping on a cheap motel mattress in less than 14 days. Stripped of his wealth, his wife, and his reputation, the golden child mutated into something unrecognizable. The polished charm evaporated, leaving behind a cornered, desperate animal. He had spent his entire life coasting on privilege and parental adoration. He never learned how to accept responsibility for his own failures. Now that the walls were closing in, he needed a scapegoat. I was untouchable, protected by the airtight legal snare Papa Charles had built. So Bradley turned his fury toward the only targets left in his line of sight. He turned on William and Patricia. The implosion of the Green family dynasty occurred inside the formal dining room of the Elm Street estate. I learned the details later from a neighbor who heard the screaming through the open windows. Bradley had driven a rented compact car to our parents' house demanding sanctuary and access to their retirement funds. He expected them to drain their savings to hire an appellate lawyer. He demanded they fix the mess. William and Patricia had nothing left to give. The secondary mortgage Bradley had secretly taken out against their home was currently in default. The commercial lender had already sent the initial foreclosure notices. My parents were drowning in the sudden terrifying reality of their own ruin. When William tried to explain that the money was gone, Bradley erupted. The golden boy shattered a crystal vase against the dining room wall. He screamed at the people who had worshipped him since birth. He blamed them for his downfall. He yelled that they should have stopped the audit. He accused William of being weak for failing to force my signature on the waiver. He pointed a shaking finger at Patricia and claimed her pathetic social climbing had distracted him from covering his tracks. He took zero accountability. He laid the entire weight of his incoming federal prison sentence squarely on their shoulders. Patricia wept openly, sinking to her knees on the expensive imported rug. She begged her son to calm down. William stood frozen, unable to comprehend the monster he had helped create. The loyalty that had bound them together for 3 decades dissolved into a bitter, toxic sludge of resentment and blame. They had sacrificed their only daughter to protect a mirage. Now the mirage was screaming in their faces, demanding blood they no longer possessed. I sat in the quiet safety of the Historical Society basement while their world burned. I was cataloging a collection of pioneer diaries, tracing the faded ink of people who had survived real hardship. My phone remained silent. The hateful text messages from extended relatives had ceased entirely. The whispers at the bakery were replaced by awkward, respectful nods whenever I walked in to buy my morning coffee. The truth had a sterilizing effect on the community. I thought about Papa Charles often during those quiet basement afternoons. I wondered if he knew how devastating the blast radius would be when he penned that final footnote. He must have known. He built his farm by clearing away the dead brush and burning the diseased crops. He understood that a healthy field required a brutal clearing of the rot. My grandfather had watched his son and grandson prioritize hollow status over hard work for decades. He saw Patricia enable the worst traits in her boy. He saw William shrink from his duties as a father to chase country club invitations. Papa did not set the trap out of spite. He set it out of a fierce, protective love for the only person in the family who valued truth over appearance. The weight of that love felt heavy on my shoulders. I was no longer the invisible archivist cataloging the past. I was the architect of the future. The Green family name had been dragged through the mud by Bradley's greed, but I possessed the tools to wash it clean. I spent my evenings drafting plans for the Black Hills farmhouse. I researched historical preservation grants and envisioned a sanctuary dedicated to the early settlers of South Dakota. I focused on building something enduring while my brother and my parents tore each other apart. The contrast between my quiet, purposeful days and their chaotic implosion was stark. They were trapped in a prison of their own making. Bradley was confined to his cheap motel room, fielding calls from angry creditors and dodging process servers. William and Patricia were trapped inside a sprawling colonial house that no longer belonged to them, waiting for the inevitable knock of the county sheriff. They had spent their entire lives running from accountability, and now it had arrived at their front door. My phone vibrated against the desk, breaking my concentration. I looked at the illuminated screen. The caller identification displayed the name of Marcus Reed. The independent forensic audit was complete. The final numbers were tallied. The legal trap was ready to snap shut one last time.
I answered the call, ready to face the final chapter of my grandfather's design. The call from Marcus Reed arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning. The independent forensic accountants in Chicago had concluded their investigation. The final numbers were tallied and the legal documents were prepared. I dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a tailored charcoal blazer and dark slacks. I gathered my canvas tote bag and drove through the quiet streets of Sioux Falls. The sky above the city was a pale slate gray, reflecting the cold finality of the day. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the law firm and stepped into the reception area. The atmosphere in the waiting room was thick with a suffocating tension. My family was already there, but they looked like hollow strangers. William and Patricia sat together on a dark leather sofa. They had aged a decade in the span of 3 weeks. My mother wore a simple beige sweater. Her signature string of real pearls was gone. Her posture, once rigid with aristocratic pride, now sagged under the weight of unrelenting stress. The pristine makeup she usually wore was uneven, failing to hide the dark, bruised shadows beneath her eyes. My father sat beside her, staring blankly at the carpet. His dress shirt was wrinkled, and his suit jacket hung loosely over his shoulders, as if his physical frame had begun to wither. Bradley sat in a chair on the opposite side of the room. He looked nothing like a visionary venture capitalist. His custom-tailored Italian suits were replaced by a rumpled, off-the-rack gray jacket. His expensive haircut had grown out unkempt and greasy. He lacked the heavy diamond watch that usually adorned his left wrist. The frozen federal accounts had stripped him of his armor. Beside him sat a weary-looking man holding a battered synthetic briefcase. This was Bradley's new legal representation. The high-priced corporate sharks had abandoned ship the moment the SEC freeze hit, leaving my brother to rely on an overworked public defender. No one spoke a word when I entered. My parents did not look up. Bradley kept his eyes firmly fixed on his scuffed dress shoes. A paralegal opened the heavy oak door and motioned for us to enter the mahogany-paneled office. The seating arrangement we chose spoke volumes about the fractured state of the Green family. William and Patricia walked to the far left side of the room, taking 2 chairs near the window. They physically distanced themselves from their son, unable to bear his proximity. Bradley and his public defender took the 2 seats on the far right. I walked directly to the center and claimed the chair situated perfectly in the middle. Marcus Reed sat behind his grand desk. He did not offer his usual polite greetings. He did not ask how anyone was coping. He operated with the clinical detachment of a surgeon preparing to amputate a diseased limb. Resting in the center of his desk was a thick spiral-bound document. Marcus picked up the heavy binder and let it drop back onto the polished wood. The loud thud echoed like a gavel striking a sounding block.
"I hold in my hands the certified results of the independent forensic audit," Marcus announced. His voice was flat and devoid of sympathy. "The investigative team spent the last 21 days tracing every financial transaction associated with Charles Green's estate and the venture capital firm managed by Bradley Green." The room grew so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of the brass clock on the wall. "The findings are incontrovertible," Marcus continued. "The auditors uncovered a systematic, ongoing scheme of corporate embezzlement. They verified the existence of multiple dummy corporations and offshore accounts. They confirmed that hundreds of vendor invoices were entirely fabricated. Furthermore, they validated that the signature of Charles Green was forged on 47 separate wire transfer authorizations." Bradley squeezed his eyes shut. He shrank down into his chair as the public defender rubbed his own forehead in silent resignation. "Due to the staggering scale of the theft discovered within these ledgers, the specific condition outlined in Charles Green's notarized footnote has failed," Marcus stated. He opened the manila folder containing the final will. "The execution of the estate is hereby legally reversed.
Eva Green inherits 90% of the total liquid assets, real estate holdings, and corporate portfolios. Bradley Green inherits 10%. My mother let out a small, wounded whimper. She pressed a trembling hand against her pale forehead. William simply squeezed his eyes shut, unable to look at his son. But Marcus was not finished. The true brutality of the legal hammer was hidden in the mathematics. The audit determined that the total sum of stolen capital amounts to $4,200,000, Marcus explained. His gaze shifted directly to my brother. Your 10% share of this estate equates to roughly $2,400,000, Bradley. However, standard probate law dictates that an estate must recover stolen assets before distributing any remaining inheritance to the offending beneficiary. Marcus paused, letting the harsh reality fill the space between them. Therefore, your entire 10% share is immediately garnished by the estate, Marcus declared. You receive nothing from this will. In fact, the math leaves a substantial deficit. You still owe the estate of Charles Green an additional $1,800,000. The golden child finally broke. The arrogant executive who had spent his life mocking my quiet archival career folded in half. Bradley buried his face in his hands and wept. A raw, ugly sob tore through his throat. His shoulders shook violently as the full weight of his ruin crashed down upon him. He was facing federal prison time. His wife had left him. He had no money, and he owed an insurmountable debt to the very sister he had tried to destroy. The public defender placed a hesitant hand on Bradley's shoulder, but offered no words of comfort. I sat perfectly still. I felt no joy watching my brother cry. I felt only a profound, sterilizing relief. The toxic illusion he had maintained for years was finally dead. I turned my attention to my parents. William let out a long, shaky breath. He looked over at Patricia. A faint glimmer of desperate rationalization flickered across my father's face. I recognized that look. He was trying to find the silver lining. He was telling himself that their son was going to prison, but they could still retreat to their sprawling colonial mansion on Elm Street. They believed they could hide behind their expensive front doors and ride out the social scandal in the comfort of their own home. They thought the worst of the damage was confined to Bradley. It was time to deliver the final strike. I reached into my canvas tote bag. I pulled out the printed PDF files I had discovered on the encrypted thumb drive hidden beneath the farmhouse floorboards. The stack of papers felt heavy with consequence. I looked at William. His eyes met mine, and the faint glimmer of relief in his expression vanished, replaced by a sudden creeping dread. He saw the cold, unbroken resolve in my posture. He did not just steal from Papa Charles, I said quietly. My voice easily cut through the sound of Bradley's weeping. I slid the stack of documents across the polished mahogany desk. The papers glided smoothly, coming to rest directly in front of my father. William hesitated before reaching out. His hands shook as he picked up the first page. "Look at the secondary mortgages, Dad," I instructed. William focused his tired eyes on the bold text at the top of the document. He read the official property deed transfer. He saw the corporate operating agreement for Elm Street Holdings. He saw his own signature staring back at him, confirming that he had blindly signed away his sanctuary to a shell company controlled entirely by his son. I watched the realization strike him like a physical blow. The color drained from his lips. He flipped to the third page detailing the high-interest commercial loan. He leveraged your house 6 months ago to cover his commercial margin calls. I explained my tone was devoid of malice, offering only the stark clinical truth. The commercial lender has not received a single payment in over 90 days. The bank is foreclosing next week. Patricia let out a sharp, piercing gasp. Patricia let out a sharp. She slapped both hands over her mouth, muffling a scream of pure terror. Her eyes widened, searching my face for any sign that I was playing a cruel trick. She looked at William. My father dropped the papers onto his lap. He seemed to physically shrink inside his suit. The rigid, arrogant spine that had supported his entire identity dissolved into nothing. They had spent 28 years protecting a son who viewed them as disposable collateral. They had eagerly participated in a vicious smear campaign to ruin their loyal daughter. They had thrown me to the wolves to protect a thief who had already burned their future to the ground. They had sacrificed everything for the golden child, and he had left them absolutely homeless. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Bradley continued to sob into his hands, oblivious to the total destruction he had unleashed upon his own parents. William stared at the foreclosure notice, unable to comprehend the magnitude of his failure. I sat in the center chair, untouched by the wreckage. The estate was secure and the truth was out, but I knew the hardest battle was still waiting for me. My parents had nothing left. They were standing on the edge of the abyss, and I knew exactly who they were going to beg for a lifeline. The appointed defender started collecting his scattered files, stuffing them hastily into a battered synthetic briefcase. He positioned a cautious hand under my brother's elbow and hoisted the ruined executive to his feet. Bradley did not look at me. He offered no more empty threats or bitter insults. His morale was shattered. He shuffled toward the door, carrying the immense weight of an incoming federal indictment. His shoulders hitched with quiet, pathetic gasps. He dragged his expensive leather shoes across the plush carpet, moving like a condemned prisoner walking toward a cold steel cell. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, sealing his fate. The faint sound of his weeping faded down the long corridor, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The estate attorney organized the dense financial binders into a neat stack. Marcus possessed enough tact to recognize the deeply personal nature of the impending fallout. He stood up from his grand desk and smoothed the front of his suit jacket. He quietly excused himself from the room, citing the urgent need to file the final probate adjustments with the county clerk. His departure left me completely alone with my parents. The spacious mahogany-paneled workspace suddenly felt cavernous. The rhythmic ticking of the brass wall clock amplified in the quiet space. William remained frozen in his chair. He stared blankly at the foreclosure notice I had slid across the polished wood. The document represented the absolute destruction of his carefully curated social identity. He looked like a man who had just witnessed his own funeral. My mother moved first. She rose slowly from the dark leather sofa. Her legs seemed unsteady, trembling noticeably beneath the hem of her simple beige sweater. She took slow, hesitant steps toward the center of the room. This was the woman who had terrorized my childhood with sharp critiques and harsh dismissals. She had demanded flawless perfection from her children, but only rewarded my obedience with chilling indifference. Now she looked incredibly frail. The arrogant armor that usually radiated from her posture had evaporated. She stopped a few feet away from my chair. She raised her hands and clasped them together in front of her chest. Her knuckles stretched tight and white. Her fingers shook violently, betraying her internal panic.
"Eva!"
Patricia whispered. Her voice cracked, fracturing into a hoarse, desperate tone. "Please!" Salty drops spilled over her lower lashes, tracing wet, messy paths through her ruined foundation. "We have absolutely nothing left. The commercial lender is going to seize our house next week. We will be forced to live on the street. Your father is too old to start a new career. His pension cannot cover the cost of a luxury rental. We are facing total ruin." I remained seated, keeping my hands folded calmly in my lap. I watched her weaponize her tears in real time. You control the vast majority of the wealth now, my mother continued. Her pitch grew more urgent, taking on a feverish, pleading quality. You manage the millions your grandfather left behind. You can pay off the secondary mortgage today. You can clear the commercial loan and save the Elm Street mansion. Give us a safe place to live. Eva Bradley is still your brother, and we are still your parents. You possess so much money now. Be the bigger person. Show some grace. Forgive us. For a single, agonizing moment. For a single, agonizing, the phantom of my past identity flared to life inside my chest. It was the ghost of a desperate little girl who had spent decades waiting for her mother to ask for her help. It was the lingering shadow of the teenager who had craved one solitary word of validation. The deep biological instinct to save the individuals who raised me tugged at my conscience. I held the financial capacity to write a single check and wipe away their impending ruin. I could become their savior. I could finally be the undisputed hero of the Green family. I felt my lungs tighten. My throat ached with the suppressed grief of a lifetime spent yearning for their genuine affection. They were offering me the role I had always wanted, but the admission price was my own self-respect. Then that phantom evaporated, quenched by the bitter reality of their recent cruelty. I looked at Patricia's weeping face, and my mind replayed the events of the past week. I remembered the crisp legal waiver she had slapped onto my kitchen counter. I remembered the fierce, unyielding hatred burning in her eyes when she demanded my signature. I recalled the blistering humiliation of standing inside the local bakery while lifelong family friends turned their backs on me, fueled by her vicious, orchestrated rumors. I remembered the calculated promise she made to banish me from her life forever if I refused to surrender my grandfather's legacy to a thief. They had not treated me like a daughter. They had treated me like an obstacle to be demolished. That short spark of pity perished, yielding a profound, liberating void. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel vindictive or cruel. I simply felt entirely free from their grasp. I stood up from my chair. My movements were fluid and unhurried. I picked up my canvas tote bag and slung the heavy strap over my shoulder. I looked down at the woman begging for her survival. You never requested him to take the high road when he committed grand larceny, I said. My voice was incredibly steady. It resonated through the quiet room with absolute ringing finality. You never asked Bradley to show mercy when he forged those wire transfers. You never demanded integrity when you co-signed his toxic loans. You actively helped him try to destroy my professional reputation just to protect your own hidden financial secrets. Patricia lowered her trembling hands. Her jaw dropped open in shock. But we are your blood, she sobbed, reaching out to grab the sleeve of my blazer. You cannot just abandon us to the banks. We made a terrible mistake. I stepped back, avoiding her grasping fingers. You made your choice, Mom, I replied softly. You chose to tether your survival to a shallow mirage. You willingly sacrificed your loyal daughter to protect a golden child who ultimately left you homeless. I am not going to pay the ransom for his crimes. I am not going to rescue the people who gleefully tried to bury me. I am enforcing the boundaries you forced me to build. William finally lifted his head from the desk. His face was a mask of utter, hollow devastation. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps, hoping to offer a belated apology or to join his wife in begging for salvation. But he found 0 words to say. The sheer magnitude of his paternal failure silenced him completely. He stared at the confident, unyielding woman standing before him. The realization washed over his features. He knew he had deliberately thrown away the only child who ever possessed the inner strength to save the family name. I did not wait for them to compose their shattered nerves. I turned my back on their weeping and walked purposefully toward the exit. Every single step I took toward the hallway felt lighter than the last, the invisible. Suffocating chains of familial obligations snapped and fell away, turning to dust beneath my boots. I walked out of the mahogany-paneled workspace, leaving my parents to sit alone in the terrifying wreckage of their own disastrous choices. 6 months have passed since the heavy mahogany door clicked shut on my former life. The brutal South Dakota winter thawed, surrendering to the tall green grass of late spring. The biting winds faded, giving way to the gentle hum of cicadas and the rich scent of damp, fertile soil. The passage of time brought a quiet, sterilizing peace to the wreckage my family left behind. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding certainty. The presiding judge handed down the official sentence on a rainy Tuesday morning in a sterile downtown courthouse. Bradley received 48 months in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The man who once wore bespoke Italian suits and drank vintage champagne now wears a scratchy state-issued uniform. He traded his corner office with the skyline view for a concrete cell measuring 8 feet by 10 feet. There are no venture capital meetings behind razor wire. There are no political galas or wealthy investors left to charm. Courtney finalized the divorce long before the judge struck the wooden gavel. She took her family money, her maiden name, and her pristine reputation, leaving him with a mountain of unpayable debt. He is entirely alone, locked away with nothing but the echo of his own hubris. The fallout for William and Patricia arrived just as swiftly. The commercial lender did not care about their country club memberships or their carefully curated social standing. The bank only cared about the missing money. Foreclosure is a clinical, unforgiving process. The sprawling colonial mansion on Elm Street went to public auction. The affluent neighbors who used to attend my mother's lavish dinner parties stood on the sidewalk and watched the commercial moving trucks haul away 30 years of hollow pride. My parents packed their designer clothes and their expensive crystal glasses into cheap cardboard boxes. Their wealthy friends stopped calling. The exclusive invitations dried up overnight. They became outcasts in the very society they had worshipped for decades. I did not allow the people who raised me to sleep on the street. Despite their intense cruelty, I could not stomach the thought of them shivering in a public homeless shelter. But I also refused to rescue their pristine status. I owned the sprawling Black Hills estate. The property included a small weathered 2-bedroom caretaker's cottage located near the far edge of the tree line. The cottage possessed sturdy walls and a reliable heater, but it offered zero luxury. There were no marble countertops or vaulted ceilings. The floors were covered in faded linoleum. The kitchen featured a single narrow window looking out over the dirt access road. I offered them the keys under a set of uncompromising conditions. I drafted a strict formal lease agreement. I required a licensed notary present when they signed the paperwork. My father pays the monthly rent using the modest funds from his diminished retirement pension. If they miss a single payment, the contract stipulates immediate legal eviction. They accepted the terms because they had zero alternatives. Now William spends his mornings pulling stubborn weeds from a tiny gravel driveway instead of practicing his golf swing on a manicured green. Patricia sits on a small wooden deck, drinking cheap store-bought coffee, watching the dust kick up from passing pickup trucks. They live in the quiet shadow of the grand estate that they tried to steal. They are tenants on my land, bound by the rules I enforce. I did not quit my job at the Historical Society. I still drive my reliable sedan to the brick building in Sioux Falls every morning. I still wear canvas coats and sturdy leather boots. I still spend my quiet afternoons cataloging faded letters and preserving the forgotten voices of the past. Sudden wealth did not alter my daily routine. The money simply removed the heavy fear of tomorrow. It provided the vast resources required to protect the things that truly matter to me. I channeled a significant portion of my grandfather's inheritance into a long-term vision. I hired local contractors and expert restoration teams to repair the physical damage Bradley inflicted upon the main farmhouse. We fixed the Pride Pine floorboards and replaced the shattered porcelain. But I did not stop at simple cosmetic repairs. I established a fully funded legal trust dedicated solely to historical preservation. The Black Hills farmhouse is now a recognized state heritage site. It serves as a living museum honoring the early agricultural pioneers of South Dakota. The land will never be subdivided or sold to a commercial developer. The tall, towering pine trees and the rich, dark soil are protected forever. Today, the late afternoon sun casts a warm, golden glow across the wraparound porch. I sit in my grandfather's favorite wooden rocking chair, the sturdy wood groans softly beneath my weight, offering a comforting, familiar sound. A ceramic mug of Earl Grey tea rests on the small rustic table beside me. Steam rises from the hot, dark liquid, twisting slowly into the cool evening air. Next to the mug lies the heavy brass wax seal bearing the Green family crest. The stylized pine tree and the sharp anvil catch the fading sunlight, gleaming with a quiet, enduring strength. I look out over the vast, quiet acres spreading toward the distant horizon. The rolling plains belong entirely to me. I survived the terrifying storm they orchestrated. I did not win by fighting dirty or sinking to their toxic level of deceit. I won by standing firm on the truth. My family tried to build a heavy cage out of guilt and societal expectations. They thought they could keep me small and silent forever. Papa Charles understood the deep rot hiding within his own bloodline. He knew his son and his grandson valued the superficial gleam of stolen gold over the honest sweat of a hard day's work. His handwritten footnote served as a brilliant legal snare designed to catch a thief. But it meant so much more than a simple transfer of vast wealth. That single paragraph, written in dark blue ink and notarized 3 days before his heart stopped beating, was a final act of profound protective love. It was the master key that unlocked my cage. I take a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, pine-scented air. I pick up my warm tea and watch the bright sun dip below the South Dakota skyline, finally at peace. In the end, the story is about much more than farmhouses, ledgers, or bank accounts. It is about the invisible foundations upon which we build our lives. In American culture, we are often uniquely obsessed with the visible markers of a successful family. We spend our lives cultivating the flawless facade, the sprawling suburban homes, the manicured lawns, the Ivy League bumper stickers, and the carefully curated holiday cards that project an image of untouchable achievement. We are taught to measure our triumphs as parents by the zip codes our children eventually inhabit and the tax brackets they reach. But beneath those polished floorboards, what is the actual structure resting upon? Is it a solid bedrock of mutual respect, emotional awareness, and uncompromising honesty? Or is it a fragile, rotting lattice of buried secrets, silent favoritism, and unspoken resentments? And to the parents listening across America, let this be a reminder that fairness is the heartbeat of a healthy home. When we favor status over character or sacrifice a shadow child to polish the ego of a golden child, we don't just divide an estate, we fracture the very soul of the family. We must ask ourselves why this dynamic is so devastatingly common. Often, parents project their own unfulfilled ambitions or deepest insecurities onto the child who shines the brightest in the ways society validates. We applaud the loud confidence, the aggressive ambition, and the superficial charm, tragically confusing these traits with genuine maturity. We pour our resources, our emotional bandwidth, and our blind unconditional trust into the child who looks the part of the American dream. In doing so, we shield them from consequence in the misguided name of love. But shielding a child from accountability is not an act of love. It is an act of parental cowardice. It stems from our own desperate fear of seeing our reflections tarnished. When we rescue our children from the natural consequences of their deceit, we rob them of the crucial opportunity to develop a moral compass. We teach them that the rules of human decency are malleable if you are charming enough, or if your failure would prove too embarrassing for the family name. True family responsibility demands the agonizing courage to let our children fall when they have done wrong. It requires the emotional intelligence to look at our children not as extensions of our own egos, but as autonomous beings who must be held to an unwavering moral standard, regardless of how brightly they shine at a dinner party. And what of the other child? The one who sits quietly in the background, cataloging the truth while the rest of the house spins in a frenzy of grand illusions. True love isn't about rewarding the loudest child. It's about seeing the quietest. The shadow children are the ones who learn far too early that their basic needs are an inconvenience. They become the emotional caretakers, the perpetual peacekeepers. The ones who instinctively shrink so that the inflated egos of others can expand. As parents, when we fail to recognize their quiet virtue, their deep honesty, their enduring patience, their unwavering loyalty, we commit a profound and lasting betrayal. We teach them that goodness is invisible and that manipulation is the only currency that buys affection. But as we have seen, the universe has a way of balancing the scales. A legacy of integrity is the only inheritance that truly lasts. While a house of cards built on favoritism will always eventually come crashing down. To the young generation especially, those of you who have felt invisible, silenced, or overlooked, know that your self-worth is not a reflection of someone else's inability to see you. For years, you may have internalized the deafening silence of your home as a final verdict on your value. You may have laid awake at night wondering if you were just a little better, a little louder, or a little more compliant. The spotlight of your parents' affection would finally shift to illuminate you. Please hear this. The spotlight was never broken. The people holding it were simply looking in the wrong direction. Their blindness was a reflection of their own devastating limitations, not your lack of value. Like Eva, your strength lies in your patience and your truth. You have spent your life observing, surviving, and cultivating a quiet resilience that the golden children of the world could never fathom. Maturity is found in the quiet courage to set boundaries and stand your ground even when the pressure of family expectations feels like a storm designed to wash you away. You are the architect of your own future, and you don't need anyone's permission to be whole. You do not owe your sanity, your peace, or your financial security to the people who simply handed you your DNA. If Eva's journey touched your heart today, or if it reminded you that your voice matters, please hit the like button and subscribe to Sophia Vengeance. We are building a community of truth tellers of shadow children who have finally decided to step into the light. Share your own story in the comments. Your courage might be the exact light someone else needs to find their way out of the shadows. There is immense transformative healing in realizing that the quiet struggles you endured in the dark are shared by thousands of others. We are socially conditioned to believe that a broken family is a tragedy, a failure of the highest order. Traditional culture insists that estrangement is a wound that must be healed at all costs, that forgiveness is a mandatory debt you owe your elders, and that maintaining the family unit is the ultimate moral good. We are told to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, to weather the abuse, because family is everything. But I offer you a different truth. one that runs counter to everything we have been taught to blindly accept. Sometimes the most beautiful, life-affirming thing you can do is strike the match and let the toxic house burn down. A family united by lies, held together only by the quiet, expected suffering of its most honest members, is not a sanctuary. It is a prison heavily disguised as a home. Walking away from blinding, toxic loyalty is not a failure of love. It is the absolute highest expression of self-love. We must stop mourning the loss of relationships that only existed to drain us. And we must stop apologizing for surviving the fire we didn't start. And always remember, character is the only inheritance that never loses its value. And the strongest houses are those built on the truth. As you look at the landscape of your own life, ask yourself a hard, lingering question. Are you protecting a home, or are you just exhaustedly guarding the ashes of an illusion? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.